Fine. Hi, everyone. I am Dr. Rachel Kowert. I am the research director of Take This, and I will be hosting the next hour on ethics and immersion in games. To start the panel off, I want to give each of my panelists a chance to introduce themselves, tell you about who they are, what they do, and a bit about their background in game studies, starting with Dr. Celia Hodand.
Thanks, Rachel. Was not ready to unmute myself.
Yeah, sorry, you're first.
Hi, everyone. So my name is Celia. I have a PhD in psychology that I had in France. I'm French originally. And in the over 12 years now, I've been working in the video game industry. So I worked at Ubisoft, I worked at LucasArts, I worked at Epic Games. I was the director of UX, as in user experience at Epic. So I worked on a bunch of games, including Fortnite, that you might have heard of. And I left Epic in October 2017, so it's been 3 years now. And I'm an independent consultant ever since then. So I help video game studios, but also tech enterprise to understand how to make things better, more accessible, more engaging. And also I talk a lot about inclusion and ethics. I also write books. I wrote The Gamer's Brain that explains how to do that in video games. And I just published today The Psychology of Video Games that explains the psychology behind making games, but also the impact of playing games. That's it.
That's it. That's a lot.
Super happy to be here.
Yeah, we're so happy to have you. And moving on to Platinum Paragon, also a doctor. I have a wonderful panel of ladies and doctors today. I'm so lucky.
Oh, brilliant. Time to introduce myself. As you said, I go by Platinum online. I have a PhD in mental health research. By day, I'm a research associate at a university. And then by night, that's when I do my psychology and video game work. My aim there is to try to bridge the gap between academia and those who play video games. I understand that not everyone who plays video games is going to know what structural equational modeling is. So I just try to take information, dissect it, make sure people are up to date with things regarding academia and video games, just make it accessible, understandable, collate things. So that's what I'm all about.
Excellent. And lastly, we have Michelle, but I think that, is Michelle here?
Yeah, I can talk. I'm just
invisible. You're here.
Oh,
hi, Dr. Michelle Colder Carras. We're working on your video, but at least we can hear you. Welcome. Tell us who you are.
I think I'm just going to make it short and say pretty much the same thing as Platinum. I probably got my PhD a couple years before her, but same thing, PhD in mental health research from a public health perspective. And I've been doing research on video games in clinical populations and how people use video games to prevent suicide, promote their mental health, and that kind of thing.
Excellent. So the panel today is called Ethics and Immersion, but really we're talking more about ethical game design and how it might cross into unethical game design in relation to the potential impacts it might have on mental health. So what happens when you try to have a clever title that is not descriptive enough? We had a lot of back and forth about what is it that we're actually talking about. So these kind of discussions typically come up when we talk about things like video game addiction, problematic play, the use of microtransactions, and the use of loot boxes. And this kind of blurry line is what we're going to talk about today on this panel. So now that I've reframed it a bit broader into ethical game design and its impact on mental health, I want to just briefly start this panel with an overview of the difference between immersion and presence. So we all have the same shared language as we move forward talking about these two things. Special shout out to Celia, who was so kind to take the time to help tease out these concepts, because I am very much guilty of using them interchangeably and also confusing them with engagement when they are in fact different and separate terms. So the TLDR is that immersion is physical immersion with your senses. So an Apple Watch would be poor immersion, but VR would be very good immersion. Presence is how you feel in the game. I like to call this psychological immersion, so you might kill me, but it's like when you drive in a car, do you feel like you're on the road or are you struggling with the interface? So presence can be physical, like how do you feel when you're playing your avatar as an extension of you. It can be emotional in relation to the music and the art, and it can be narrative, part of which being empathetic game design, perhaps, like we just talked about. So all of these things, presence and immersion, can play a role in engagement, but engagement is about motivation. motivation to play the game? Is the game challenging enough? Does it put you in a state of flow? Is it giving you a good sense of presence and immersion? So that might have been more information than you needed, but all of these terms are going to be used in today's talk. So I just want to make sure that we're all have a general idea of what we are talking about. So now, enough with that. Let's get on with it. So in 2012, there was an article published by Elliott and colleagues titled "Video Game Genre as a Predictor of Problematic Use." Now, in the article, they found that player versus player interaction, competitive gaming, Michelle's here, hi, competitive gaming against other players in both first-person shooters, action-adventure, and role-playing games showed the strongest relationship with problematic play. And what the authors suggested is that we should conduct more research looking into specific design elements and reward mechanics, such as those associated with competitive play, that contribute to problematic or negative outcomes. So there have been similar research looking at more role-playing games like World of Warcraft that found the aesthetics, the sense of presence, and the social reinforcement of play also contribute to kind of compulsive or overuse of games in a negative way. So I wanted to start with you, Celia. Sorry, usually I have you prompted as first for all of these, so we'll just get that out of the way. As a UX expert, have you found in your work that there are certain design elements or triggers that are particularly impactful for the player that increases immersion and or presence, but also may perhaps have the potential to contribute to maladaptive outcomes?
Well, yeah, so it's not my research, it's more gaining from the research of others. But for sure, a game that's going to be not immersive, but given a good sense of presence and motivating, has more risk to get people like super into it and having a hard time to disconnect. The thing that we're looking the most, so presence is going to have a huge influence on motivation, because of course you're more motivated if you feel that you are in the game, that you have an impact in the game. So we're looking at many things when we try to make a game more engaging. One of the things that we know might have an impact on what we call sometimes addiction, but I prefer to say pathological play, is if the game gives you a great sense of competence, autonomy, and relatedness. This is what we call the SDT, so self-determination theory, and it's all about intrinsic motivation. Turns out that great games offer great satisfaction in terms of competence. You feel that you're in control, that you're getting better. Of course, sense of presence has a huge impact on that. It also offers you autonomy. You feel that you can express yourself, and relatedness, you can play with others, etc. So it turns out that this is one of the important ingredients to make a game engaging and interesting. But turns out that some research has shown that that players in real life who don't have a lot of satisfaction for these needs in their real life might fall more into games to get that satisfaction. So that's one of the many needs that we have that is aligning what we try to do to make games better and impact on mental health. There's also dark patterns, but I'm not, we can talk about that, but maybe in a second part, but I don't want to talk too much.
No. I mean, that's a great place to start. Self-determination theory, I think, is a really important thing to talk about in terms of games being engaging. I'm going to pivot this to Michelle. So if a game is a well-designed game, then unethical, right? If perhaps that could potentially lead to negative mental health outcomes. Or what have you also found in your work in terms of kind of the flip side? Where do we draw that line? Michelle, that's for you. Did we lose Michelle?
Okay, unmuted.
Oh, she's here. Okay. Oh,
Yeah,
you're muted. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry. There's a couple of ways to think about it. So I'll just talk about it in the context of mental health recovery, because that's the way I usually think of it. And it overlaps a little bit with what you were talking about with regard to kind of positive mental health and things that we need to satisfy in order to have flourishing mental health. So immersion from a health perspective, there's a few different things. There's the social environment. So being immersed in the social environment can be really good for you. It can satisfy needs that you can't get satisfied in real life. And, you know, whether you should be able to or not, like now in COVID times, who can get their social needs satisfied in real life? Not as many people, right? But if you think from the perspective of people who have specific challenges like PTSD or disabilities, this may be the, one of the few ways they can really connect socially and immerse themselves in a community. Second, one thing that I've looked at is this idea of flow. So flow can be great, right? Like if you're so engaged in an activity that you lose sense of time and you lose sense of where you are, that can be so refreshing and rewarding. But you could see where it could also cause trouble. But in the clinical populations that I've spoken to about their gaming, it can distract you from suicidal urges. It can distract you from drug cravings. So these are things that could be literally life-saving. So when we think about that aspect of immersion, the flow aspect, it's often blamed for these problematic things, but at the same time, from a harm reduction perspective, it could actually be really, really useful. There's also, flow can also possibly be a factor in preventing the integration of negative memories, like after a trauma. So Bejeweled has been shown to work possibly to reduce depression, but playing Tetris after a trauma can interfere with the formation of memories. And there's something else that I wanted to talk to about reframing and meaning, but I'm gonna skip for now.
Okay, we'll come right back to that, but first I want to see if Platinum wants to add anything to this discussion.
Yeah, just in terms of, I think there's a potential range of things you could talk about in terms of, what could be considered unethical game design. I think one thing that I find quite interesting is the idea that, designers and maybe publishers themselves, they may push the idea of frustrating someone or fatiguing someone in the hopes that you'll maybe spend a bit more money in the game. And I think that's quite a challenge in terms of games like Star Wars Battlefront 2, I think was one of the big games that brought this discussion about ethical microtransactions into the forefront. Because let's say you're a really big Star Wars fan, you want to be present in the world of Star Wars, you want to play as all these different amazing characters that the Star Wars universe has to offer. I've got some information here about what the state of, pre-controversy Battlefront 2 was supposed to look like. If you wanted to be fully present in the world of Star Wars and play as all these different characters, you'll be looking at spending over $2,000, or if you didn't want to spend the money and you just wanted to earn it in-game, you'll be looking at 4,500 hours. And that breaks down in terms of character. That's a full work week. That would be a 40-hour work week to play as one character in a video game. So let's say you punch in 2 hours a day after work. You get to a Friday and you're like, I am a quarter of the way to Darth Vader. I want to play as Darth Vader. So you just whip out the credit card. You're tired. I'm not doing this anymore. So I think it's interesting the way it just, from a design perspective, instead of thinking about how do we make this game fun, how do we make it engaging, the conversation kind of gets flipped into how do we exhaust our players? How do we get more money out of them after they've paid $60 for the game that we made for them? And I just think that's really tragic.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, and also a good way to kind of shift how we think about it. It's not about making them more engaged, perhaps, but making more money. And it's funny you mentioned about frustration, because I know there's work that comes out of the Oxford Internet Institute that's found that frustration in games is actually what underlies these short-term links between playing a game and having short-term increases in aggressive cognitions afterward. So it's not violent content in games, but it's frustration in games. And I would be frustrated enough to just buy Darth Vader if I had to play that many hours, I have to say. So let's go back then to reframing and meaning, Michelle, if you want to touch on that before, because I do want to talk about loot boxes and microtransactions after we talk a bit more about problematic play.
Yeah, sure. And I think, this aspect has to do with the meaning that people were talking about in the previous panel of, empathy in games. So gamers that I've spoken to they've talked about how they considered how, for example, just the game mechanics can help them with real life conflicts. Like instead of angrily confronting someone that they need to have a conversation with, where they know it's just going to devolve into yelling, they can assertively say something and then, you know, kind of step back and just distance a little bit. And the person who told me this said, I learned this from a boss fight, where what I had to do in the boss fight was attack, gain aggro, and then turn the guy. So it was like a constant shifting, and he was able to connect that to something that he needed to do in real life. So it's like taking this problem solving from the games and applying it in a way that's really useful. There's also this idea where people can learn from the fact that, you know, even if I'm trying to work through the 12 steps, recover from an addiction, if I'm feeling super, super clinically depressed, in a game, I can be persistent. In a game, I can be an important member of a team. And if you're really at the point where you're suffering and you feel like you can't do that in real life, it could be a bridge, like scaffolding, to recognize that there's something different in you that you didn't really think was there. So those can be good ways to support mental health. But, you know, by the same token, if you're getting those things in a game, it's just really important to realize that there has to be a way to move on. And we have to make it clear that the things that we get from games, you know, we can't rely on them in a way that we would, you know, it would maybe be easier to. So then how do you identify when it's time to move on, when you have the capability to do things without maybe the support of the game, or like, you know, thinking of it as kind of scaffolding. And unfortunately, I feel like those elements that would promote that are really not that present in games. So those moments that allow people to reflect on how they're playing, or to take a break and step away, those are things that we could really spend more time and energy investing in. How do we do that? You know, like, what would that look like? So I've heard a little bit about it, you know, things like breakpoints. Those are really easy, simple things we could put in. But also just integrating things that allow people to self-regulate, and taking out the things that make self-regulation harder. Those things, they're not very ethical.
That's an interesting point. So there is a line, you're saying there is a line where designers may be unethically leveraging, you know, intermittent reinforcement or daily quests or whatever it might be, to keep their players engaged. And perhaps if we were to sit down with a bunch of game designers, almost as if we are right now, we might talk a bit more about what you just called as disengaging mechanics.
Yeah, disengaging, that's a good way to think of it. And one thing I would say, this is where I'm going to come down really hard. I would say if a designer is using analytics to determine who is engaging the most and trying to get them to engage more, or to bring in other people who will play like them, I would say that's unethical. That is, there's no way you can justify that from an ethical perspective.
Interesting. Do you have, Celia and Platinum, would you like to add to that?
Sure. I'll go first. First of all, what Platinum was saying earlier is, to me, is what I call a dark pattern. So this is not like you were saying anything to improve the game in terms of you know, make it better and make it more engaging. It's about making people pay more. So to me, that should be either a shady practice or definitely a dark pattern. But there is a line, and sometimes this line is clear, just like all the practices. Sometimes when we force players to play more, to be frustrated so that they are compulsively like buying something. But sometimes it's not as clear. You know, if you think of a game like a Tamagotchi game, typically it's a game when you have like a creature and you take care of that creature, and if you don't take care about that creature, it dies. Is this, you know, by definition an unethical game? Because if you're not attending to the creature, it's not doing well? Or is it unethical if we put too much pressure on the player? Like, let's say if the player has to come back every hour to feed the Tamagotchi, then it's not ethical. But if it's once a week, then, you know, it's easier to manage it. In that case, you know, you have specific games that the specific design of this game requires the player to play, to develop, etc. And so this is when the line is not as clear. But absolutely need to define these lines, and we need to define what is it we are. So in game design, we don't necessarily say things to disengage. We talk about what is it we reward and what is it we punish. So for example, you kill your enemy, you get rewarded. That's a thing that we do reward players doing that. If you quit the game and while you quit the game, all your friends are leveling up, and so you come back, you feel punished. And so we think about these elements in terms of reward and punishing, and we don't want to punish disengagement. That would, to me, is an ethical line that we should not cross. And you have games like World of Warcraft, they did something interesting, like when you disconnect and you rest, when you come back, you have double XP for a while, depending on how long you rested. And so that to me is actually not punishing disengagement, and you're rewarded in somehow, because if you rest, then you can catch up to your friends. So it's more framing in terms of where's the line. Sometimes it's clear, sometimes it's blurry. And also, what is it we can do to encourage players to stop and take a moment for reflection. And this is more about what is it we're punishing and what is it we're rewarding, if that makes sense.
It does. Thank you. Platinum, anything to add?
Yeah, this is really interesting. I kind of want to marry the 2 points, the one that Michelle made, one that Celia made. It's this idea of, not punishing disengagement, kind of incentivizing disengagement, and also the idea that was mentioned at the beginning about things like self-determination theory. There's some interesting research by academics such as Stavropoulos et al. And Mills et al. That found that people who, play video games to a sort of dysfunctional degree do so for reasons such as desire for achievements. So I did some interesting look into, the idea of, people playing for those achievement purposes. I want to use a case study from a game, Final Fantasy XI. They introduced a boss in that game called Absolute Virtue, which players had to sit at the one place, work together and beat for 18 hours. So you're thinking people must have to realize, I want to be the upper echelons of a Final Fantasy XI player. I want to have that achievement. I want to be the person to beat Absolute Virtue. It's crazy to sit there for 18 hours at the one time to play that. So you think, they can't get any more ludicrous than Absolute Virtue. They absolutely got more ludicrous than Absolute Virtue. They introduced a boss then called Pandemonium Warden. And there's news stories about this from about 12 years ago, where people had to stop their attempts to beat Pandemonium Warden because they were passing out at their desk and they were vomiting at their desk. So that was, that kind of the older MMO, Final Fantasy XI. There's now a new Final Fantasy MMO, Final Fantasy XIV, that is directed by someone called Naoki Yoshida. And I just want to give a quick quote from an interview that he actually gave in the topic of things like immersion and engagement. He said, "It's all right not to play every day. Come back and play it to your heart's content. When the major patch kicks in, then stop before you get burned out." So this was a series of games that was, infamous for these ludicrous 18+ hour, you have to sit at your desk that entire time. And now it's like, I don't want you to get addicted. Come and go whenever you please. And it's a very successful, well-loved game. So I just want, developers to know that they don't have to make sure they have the market share in time commodities in terms of getting people to sit there and play for the one time. You can have ethical game designers who don't want you to get addicted, and your product can be commercially successful.
18 hours. Oh my God. That's ridiculous. And talking about time and time played, because when I think of unethical game design, the first thing I thought about was perpetual worlds like World of Warcraft, games that encourage daily quests. But then it also has me thinking, is that really on the game designer, or like a Tamagotchi, or is that just the way the game is designed? And maybe the line is, much more obvious. Maybe the line is 18-hour boss fight, right? Maybe it's not as gradient as it seems. Any other dark parts we should talk about, Celia, before we move on to microtransactions? I just want to know, is there like a list?
Oh, I mean, if we're going to talk about microtransactions, we're going to have more occasion to talk about that. Yeah, maybe to bounce on what Platinum was saying. Yeah, game designers need to know that, but also executives need to know that, because sometimes, you know, it's not, these things are not coming from the game designers. They're coming from upper level, and so it's hard also to define, you know, what is coming from the love of making games. And like you were saying, there are some games that require you to play for long, like D&D, you know, it's Dungeons and Dragons. Typically, it's a game that's going to take a while, because the whole point of the game is to develop your strategies and to develop your character, and you need to come back week after week to play with your friends. So it's hard for me to say that there's a game genre that is unethical. There are games that you just play for just one shot, and games that are taking a long time. I don't think this is a problem. This is more of a problem if, for some people that we need to help and help them stop. So we should definitely try to work on that. And it's also a problem if you use these tensions to make more money. And in terms of like the 18-hour, that's of course completely nonsensical. But you have like sports events that's all about pushing yourself. So we do that in other areas, not just in video games. But it's when it's framed as a contest, then, you know, it's more socially acceptable. When we should ask ourselves, you know, it's pushing a lot of people to do long hours of contest that can be physically very difficult.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to, I mean, a bit about what we were talking about yesterday with like crunch in the workplace. There's this idea of gamers have to be like so hardcore and for the love of the game in 18 hours and I can do it. And that's not good for anybody. That's not good for anybody. So really what it sounds like, what I'm getting from this conversation, it becomes unethical when it's exploitative for the bottom line. Right. Now, before we move away from this discussion, I do want to go back to Michelle, just to see if there's anything else you wanted to add about breaking immersion as a way to prevent excessive play, because I know this is something you've talked about before.
Actually, I did, and I also wanted to comment on that last thing you said.
Mm-hmm.
So there's being purposefully exploitative, whatever, like, you know, seeking these individual players who you can better monetize, or you can better monetize that player type. That's not good at all. But then there's this concept of, if someone is going to sit and play for many, many hours at a time, is there a group of people that could do that without any significant interference to their lives? Like, it is a continuum, and it depends on who the person is, where they are in their life, what their competing demands are. So then, let's say you do want to develop an event or something. You were talking about achievements. I kept thinking of the World of Warcraft achievement that gives you the title, The Insane. Do you remember that one, where you have to get all that reputation with the Booty Bay Buccaneers or whatever it is? It
is the worst achievement. That takes so many hours. Yeah.
Exactly. But, you know, it's seen as a mark of honor, right? And we see that with other types of hazardous technology use, like binging on Netflix. It's just a huge joke right now, right? But how many hours has everyone lost of their time just doing that? Anyway, what was the other question? Breaking immersion, right? So that's one thing that came up from my research, was this idea of, if you want me to be better at self-regulating, then, you know, let me set an alarm that just pops up a window in the middle of my beautiful exploration that says, hey, you know, 4 hours ago, you said you wanted to take a break in 4 hours. Or like, you know, don't make it so that I can constantly explore the sandbox world for more than an hour, you know, have something timed, or have something where I need to take a break and step away and see if I need to come back, or I need to do something else.
So do you think that's something that should be put on the game designers in terms of integrating it into the game? Because this more gets into the discussion of, do they need to cater to the most vulnerable, or is this, or not, I guess would be the question.
I think I would say that now that we have an understanding of it, it makes sense to allow players the choice. And so if you're choosing not to give players that choice, then that says something about how you want to develop a game, whether it's the designer, which, you know, I imagine 90% of designers, it's not. Or something coming from the top down where, no, we don't need to put those breakpoints in because then people don't keep paying to advance or whatever. So yeah, I would say it's pretty clear that these things help. So they should be built into games. That is my, that's my take on it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like Celia was saying about World of Warcraft doesn't punish logging off because you get double XP, whereas other games may punish logging off or not coming in every day.
I mean, I know, honestly, I'm playing Duolingo the most now. That's the thing I'm playing. And if I see my streak freezes up, like if my streak freeze is in danger, I'm going to go back to it. But that takes me 20 minutes. So if you need to do your daily quest or you're going to lose like a daily quest streak and that takes an hour, that's different, I'm interested in what Celia thinks about that idea, though, like the responsibility of the developers and whether it comes from the top down and whatever.
I was just laughing because Duolingo, if you stop using it, you have a little owl that's sent to you crying. So they're not out of the woods in terms of dark patterns. Yeah, no, I hear you. I think it's a good thing to think if you have a game that is a role-playing game, this typical the games that it's never ending. It would be good to have a mechanic whereby the character at some point gets tired. And so you need to rest. Otherwise, you're not as efficient as, at playing the game. That's totally doable. But then we have to think also that not all these games are engaging and make tons of money. It's actually, you have a lot of studios that are struggling to survive. And so it's hard to say from the beginning, you have to think about all that. Most studios, they just think about surviving. We should definitely lead the way, like all the big studios and people are the most visible should lead the way, and we should talk about these things, definitely. Yeah.
I guess I would ask both of you guys, if it's okay, or all of you guys, what do you think about the concept of, I know that, as a person who has studied a lot of problematic gaming, it's gotten me a little annoyed that there are these international consensus on things from various people who choose themselves for doing the international consensus. But it sounds like we are a group of people who try to see the nuance of, each side of the ethical questions here. What would you think about if we started to pull together some suggestions to say, hey, these are some researched suggestions for how designers could improve the healthy play for their players. And then, that was something that we offered out there, because I have spoken to some people in the industry who've given me this, the idea that there's really not anything like any specific set of recommendations. So
funny that you're saying that, because with a few people from the industry and academia, we've started an initiative called Ethical Games. And on the website, we are listing a bunch of things. Right now it's just a draft, but this is what we're trying to do. We want academic people, so please feel free to help us out with that, to list, all the things that we should think about really in a scientific way, so that we can come up with really clear guidelines to make more ethical games. So I know we don't have that yet. That's the reason why we absolutely need to do it. It's going to take a few months to put all that together, but that's the hope, that we can do it and then make sure that game developers follow that.
That's great. That was my segue. I was just setting that up for Celia.
Thank you. That's awesome.
Great job. Platinum, anything to add?
Yeah, just quickly, forgive me, I read a lot of research. I don't have the citation offhand, but I remember this really interesting paper that I read. It was very simply presented. They're like, oh, dysfunctional gaming is a big problem these days, et cetera, et cetera. How do we manage this? How do we even begin to tackle it? And one thing that they tried was just they gave a group of people who were exhibiting symptoms of dysfunctional gaming Fitbits. And I was like, okay, you can track your fitness, you can take control of your own life, you can keep track of your sleep, keep track of your steps, things like that. And it actually did help lower the amount of time that they spent playing video games. So this idea of agency, getting people to take control of their own life. We mentioned the idea that, maybe they're playing games as a method of obtaining achievements. If they see like a nice little graph that, they've been doing more steps every day, then by all means, that will be given the same sort of achievement and a sense of accomplishment than what you get from, a little tick in your, achievement log. So I think even something that we can make these simple steps, it doesn't have to be this monumental problem that can't be challenged or broken down whatsoever. There's really interesting ways to apply the research that we've talked about in order to keep people as safe and as healthy and as happy as possible.
That's great, because I've also read research about, we do a lot of surveys, us researchers, about how many hours of games do you play, and people are very bad at guessing. So I bet the Fitbit is like, oh, I've spent how many hours playing this week? But whose responsibility is it though? So that was a research study where they were clearly developing an intervention. Is this an industry responsibility, or what do you think, Platinum?
I think that is a great question, because while I've been thinking about these questions, thinking about how best to prepare this panel, I was prepared for the eventuality of like, how do we tackle loot boxes? How do we tackle microtransactions? And at the very end of the day, you're basically saying, hey publishers, hey game developers, please stop making as much money as you do right now. Please take these suggestions to lower your income. I don't feel like it's going to be a very practical conversation, but I feel like at the same time, I think it's great that things like the Ethical Games Initiative is happening, because one thing I was actually going to suggest is the idea of empowering people, letting them know what's happening in their brain. So for example, this was a couple of years ago, there was very little research into things like loot boxes. I was just trying to give people as much information as possible. People were saying to me, Platinum, what is your brain on loot boxes? So I tried to, give as much information on things like gamblers' fallacies, things like that. So the idea of, maybe you buy 5 loot boxes, those loot boxes are a bust. You think, well, if I buy another 5, then that means I'm closer to getting what I want, even though it doesn't matter. You could buy those other 5 a couple of days later, a month later, your odds are still going to be the same. But it's this idea that, our brains trick ourselves into thinking this. So I think because we're at a point where we might be asking people to earn less money, I think it's kind of our responsibility at this point, just at this point. I hope the industry evolves to be more ethical in a couple of years or so, but at this point, I think we should really be empowering other people with knowledge of what their brain is like on loot boxes and what they can do to maybe take control of their own patterns of gaming.
I agree. You're not gonna be able to go to the industry and say make less money. They're gonna tell us to leave. But I think by providing guidelines and providing information, and with the work that you do, Platinum, with your website and with the editorials that you write, is about getting that information to gamers so they do know that loot boxes are like a draw on the hat. Don't buy more. You have a better chance of getting it if you just buy more. So I think we should pivot to loot boxes, because I know we all have a lot to say about it. And I think that loot boxes and microtransactions are generally at the heart of discussions about potentially unethical game design. There's been a lot of legal discussions about loot boxes. Just to clarify, a loot box is what they call a consumable virtual item that the player purchases. It's totally random. It can be something that helps you in the game, like weapons or armor, or it could be a cosmetic thing for your player. A loot box is a microtransaction. A microtransaction just means purchasing virtual goods, but there are microtransactions that are not loot boxes, like buying in-game currency or you see what item you're buying in the game. So we'll go down the row of my wonderful panelists. Are loot boxes unethical as they are now? It's a loaded question.
Do you want me to start?
Sure.
All right. So overall, I would say most of the time, yes, but it depends on many things. First of all, if the loot box can only be gained using currency, so you have currency in the game, because that's the thing. You don't buy the loot box directly. You buy in-game currency and then you spend it on loot box and all other stuff. So if it's really hard to not be able to have that currency without buying it, if the loot box contains things that are really useful for you for the gameplay versus cosmetic, if the game is played by a lot of children, then yes, it's totally unethical, because we know that variable rewards are more engaging. Most of the time, it's not always true. Like your salary, you don't want it to be variable reward, but it's more engaging. And in games, it's been used a lot. It's used in any game when you have a draw of cards or a throw of dice. And in games like Mario Kart, you jump to get the bonus. You don't know what you're gonna get. That's also a variable reward. But it becomes a problem when it's used to create some tension and you want something and you might get it if you buy loot boxes and you need to pay for them. And children have much more difficulty than adults to self-regulate because their prefrontal cortex is not mature yet. It takes up to 25 years of age to mature. And so for children, it's even more difficult. So that's why gambling is not allowed under a certain age. It depends on the countries. So overall, I would say yes, but it depends on many variables that makes it either better or worse.
I think Platinum
Michelle?
should go next.
Oh, Platinum, go on.
Yeah, more than happy to. So for me, I think that, in their current form, the way they commonly appear in gaming, I do think it is quite unethical. And in saying that, I'm going to address a fallacy that I see over and over again in relation to loot boxes. And it's the idea that trading card games like Magic the Gathering and Yu-Gi-Oh! Have existed for years. They're like blind draws. You don't know what you're going to get whenever you buy a pack of cards. A loot box is just like buying a pack of trading cards. And I don't buy that for two reasons. The first reason is the fact that I could go and buy a pack of cards for something like Magic the Gathering, and it could be a bust. I can get something that's either I have, a bunch of in my drawer, or it could be, a card that's not really applicable to the way I play the game. What I can do then is I can give these spares away. I can give them to a friend, get them interested in the game, or I can even just sell them. I mean, I've seen shops that have like wall to wall of, second-hand trading cards. The second thing is that, let's say there's a card I really want to complete my deck. And, I want to try and get it the quote unquote honest way. I'll support the developers. I'll buy the cards, see if I get lucky. I buy the cards, I'm not lucky. At the end of the day, I can go, you know what? I'm just going to go to eBay. I'm just going to get what I want on eBay. I'm sick of this, luck of the draw. There are ways for me to get what I want. So typically in the current form, if you get a loot box, you can't really give or trade anything that you have that's tied to your account. If you get a cool skin for a character that your friend plays, I can't give that skin to my character. And let's say, for example, if you're looking at a game like Overwatch, let's say you really want to, as I did whenever I played Overwatch, I really wanted to play as the Anubis Forest skin. There was no way for me to get that skin without doing the random lottery every time of loot boxes. I couldn't say, look, developer, here's $5. Can I please have this cool skin? Can I please play the game I want to play it? And to this day, I haven't played Overwatch in about 3 years, and I'm still angry that I never got to play as the Anubis Forest skin. So in the current form, in terms of I can't trade or give away anything I get from the loot box, there's no other way for me to obtain what I want in terms of the random lottery. So I think in those two main reasons are why I consider them to be unethical. But again, we go back to the idea of, if we say to a developer, introduce a way for me to give $5 for a Noosfera, that's going to undercut loot box sales. So, what do you do at that point? It's just really frustrating.
Those were some really good opinions. And I think one of the reasons I wanted to go last is because I'm still trying to formulate how I feel about this. I think until very recently, I felt like loot boxes were maybe not as big a deal, but now I've done a little more research into gambling and to behavioral addictions in general. And again, I'm doing the addictions with like a, air quotes. To me, loot boxes seem pretty close to gambling, but not close enough that you could definitely say they're gambling. And I don't like the fact that they're not labeled as being gambling-like, because then people are learning these, their minds are learning these gambling fallacies without really being made aware that it's kind of like gambling. So the idea that kids could start trading, like even without any money changing hands, they could start gambling what they have for a chance at a virtual something else. I mean, I don't think that's a really good idea. I think it would be fairly easy to label loot boxes as a gambling-like mechanism, even if you didn't want to say they were gambling. And I know that some industry folks I've spoken to are pretty clear that this is not gambling because no real money is necessarily changing hands. I think what Platinum was talking about also was that in a way, the virtual environment is almost worse for this, because after you have done your loot boxes, you don't have anything to show for it if it's not what you were looking for. You can't give it away. You can't do anything with it. So it sounds like, you know, it might even be a little more difficult than the collectible type games. And other things like microtransactions in general, I could see a problem where if it's not clearly labeled and discussed, say parents don't know about it, then yeah, a kid can spend a lot of money. And maybe it's the kid who would otherwise be getting into some other kind of difficulty. But, you know, gosh, microtransactions would make that super, super easy if it's not really clear that they are present in a game, or like something that really helps with advancement, for example.
The no money changing hands and the argument that you always get something, right? Those are the two arguments that you always see about saying why loot boxes are not gambling. But would it be fair to say that it might be more accurate if it was framed as gambling, perhaps with the caveat of you can't sell them and you can't trade them? Like, I'm not sure how that exactly plays into it not being gambling. Anyone have any thoughts on that? Because I know that's what they always say. It's just, you can't trade, you can't sell. It's no money's changing hands.
It's like loot boxes. It's just like gambling, but it's not. I don't know, something like that.
Yeah. But like Celia said.
So first of all, you have games where you can trade them. You have sometimes, you know, secondhand marketplace, and just like eBay, you know, you're not supposed to do that, but you do it anyway. So it's not part of Magic the Gathering to offer a place to do that, but you have secondhand marketplaces that do that, and you have a lot of online games that actually do that. And yeah, the thing about getting money in your hands at the end of the day, gambling is about, you want something of value. And if you decide that this has value in the game, if it's virtual or not, you know, it's just like social relationship in the virtual space. There is still social relationship. So I don't know if the argument that it's a pack and you can't trade, it makes it better. You know, Magic the Gathering, you need those cards that actually have an impact on gameplay. So it's even more pressure for you to get that, rather than in Overwatch, it's just cosmetic. So technically you don't need it. Sure, you want it, so maybe you put some value into it, and so that still makes it a problem, especially since this is not a game that is free to play, so you actually pay the game, and on top of that you have this. So I think it's a bit complex, and we should not shy away from terms. I mean, you can spend money to get something that you consider of value, and it's random. So psychologically, it's the same principle as gambling.
So maybe like just making it clear, you know, this game has loot boxes, and loot boxes are like gambling. Even if you're not trading money, it's gambling. So some people like gambling, you know. I'm not a fan of gambling. I'm not that much of a risk taker. But, you know, if you like gambling, then try these loot boxes, I guess.
There you go. There's a good advertisement for loot boxes, Michelle. Someone in the chat said, was reinforcing what Celia was saying. It's about value. It's not about money. And someone else mentioned money does change hands because you're converting pseudo tokens for things of value, which can then be sold or purchased to buy in-game products. Whenever I talk about loot boxes, I have similar advice to what you guys have said. It should only be cosmetic items. I am a fan of reporting drop rates because, again, I think information is power. And I think those are things that the industry could do that wouldn't necessarily reduce their bottom line, but it would make it more ethical and more transparent. Do you think that loot boxes and microtransactions, I know that they are on the ESRB warnings, like it will say like game contains microtransactions, but do you think they should be things that are not included in games under children for the age of 18?
Yeah, for me, yes. You know, if you can buy the currency with real money, and then you can buy loot boxes with them, and I would say yes. It's not just like casinos. That the age is just helping, making sure that it's not used on the population that it's harder for them to self-regulate. It's not impossible, but already as adults we have sometimes a hard time self-regulate, and so the younger we are, the harder it is. So if it's a game dedicated for children, it should never be any loot box. And if it's a game for everyone and it happens to have a lot of children playing it or teenagers, I would agree that there should not be loot boxes in there.
Platinum, what do you think?
Yeah, so in terms of, just to touch on a point that Celia made, the idea that your prefrontal cortex keeps developing until around the age of 25, I recognize that we're running, we're getting to the 10-minute mark of the talk. So there's one thing I did want to mention, and I think it segues really nicely into this idea of, people under 18 and things like that. So this is something I actually learned a bit more about whenever I was researching for this talk, and it was the idea of FIFA. So FIFA is an incredibly popular game, especially, with younger people. I've seen like pretty much every young boy, if you don't mind me sort of stereotyping, I find it hard to not meet, especially where I live, we're all a bit football, soccer happy, things like that. So FIFA is a very common game. And it was actually, shout outs to Gaming the Mind, they're the ones that actually brought my attention to this. There's a pro player, a professional FIFA player, that said, actually this year I am not going to buy any FIFA points and my sponsor supports that. So I did a little bit more reading into this whole FIFA points thing and the idea of, the loot boxes and stuff surrounding FIFA. So the stipulation was that instead of getting the sponsor to pay for the loot boxes, they would instead give the money to charity. And it turned out that the amount of money that the sponsor had budgeted for that one player to buy their loot boxes for their competitive edge for competitive FIFA was €2,000. So think about this in the context of kids in the playground. You are horrible at FIFA. You come around to my house. You're terrible at FIFA. We play online. You keep losing. Young susceptible kids, they would keep seeing you lose, you lose, you lose because you didn't pay to win. And that becomes, mommy, daddy, get me the FIFA points. So because there's this social pressure, you keep seeing you lose. Your friends might be, they might get, pocket money, they might get, €20 a week or something. They might spend that on the points, increases the likelihood of them winning. Happier kids. So this idea of, FIFA points, under 18s, things like that. I can't imagine what it would be like to be a parent under these circumstances. Just please, get me these so I can start beating my friends more. There must be social pressure. There must be frustrations. So I absolutely do agree that, when we're dealing with people under the age of 18, big red flag there. Big red flag.
Yeah, it's the social oh, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
No, Dr. Michelle, go on.
I mean, so those were two really good ideas. And I think I was going to say, okay, definitely not for loot boxes because that's gambling. So it's pretty straightforward. For microtransactions, I'm still not sure because I have kids. I remember, they're young enough that they have been playing games where they've asked for money to advance in their games. But yet at the same time, I value autonomy very strongly, like unusually strongly. So if a kid wants to waste their $20 allowance on paying to advance, they get a $20 allowance, then that's what they can do with it. Too bad if they lose their allowance because they spent it on video games. But, maybe that's not the best because like Platinum said, those kids are going to be coming to you and saying, please, I really just need another $5. And you're going to hear that again and again. So perhaps it is best to build in a little more other regulation for those populations that are struggling with it.
Yeah, especially since they want something now because it's hot now, but then in a month something else is going to be hot. And teenagers, they need to have a strong feeling of belonging to a social group. So the pressure is even harder for them to manage. So I would say, I mean, spending $20 in a game is not the problem. It's having to spend regularly a lot of money to keep up with the social pressure, and it's always new stuff. So that's more of the problem.
Yeah, and I did want to say with regard to trying to ask developers to do something that would reduce their profits. I think one thing that we should be clear of is the profit level for the video game industry is quite high. The profit margin is very, very, very high, like pharma high. So I don't feel a lot of compunction. I know that there are many small studios trying to get off the ground, but I don't feel a lot of compunction saying, maybe it's going to reduce your profit margin a little, but you know, it's time to start thinking in terms of what's best for your players a little bit and balance that with the, you know, the capitalist nature.
We need to make them, because the problem, like, we're in a capitalist economy, and so they don't have any incentives to not do better financially. And in fact, you know, shareholders are not happy if,
and honestly,
if the money is not going up, 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 and up. So it's a bigger problem. I think all these things that we tackle is also the bigger problem, is that our society is not currently rewarding the people who do the ethical things to do.
Yeah, and it's tough to say that we need to use the stick instead of the carrot. But, you know, I've been honestly talking with game industry folks for years. And all I've heard is, they're not going to want to reduce their profits. So
we should use the carrot.
Huh?
We should use the carrot, but on a bigger scale. Like, we should reward companies that are ethical.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. I like the idea of like the stamp. Your game is ethical. You've passed these tests, and then parents will be more likely to want to buy that game. So that makes sense.
That's not a bad idea. I mean, you look at like fair trade clothing.
Exactly.
Fair gaming.
Yeah, fair gaming. Well, I hope that the ethical guidelines that you're putting together, Celia, that could become the standards.
It's a long road ahead, but yes, that's the hope.
Yes. Be sure you share that link in the Slack so we can all look at it and see how
ethicalgames.org.
There we are, ethicalgames.org. We didn't get a chance, we're out of time, but we didn't get a chance to talk about the social reinforcement of games, which I think is really important. And I know we talked a lot about children, and I do think that children and adolescents need to be more protected than adults, but my husband spent a lot of money on microtransactions. So it's not only children, so we need to consider a lot, but enough to make me irritated. So I hope everyone enjoyed this panel. It's been lovely talking to you three about these topics. And I think there was a lot of chatter in the chat, and we of course will be on Slack if there's any other questions after the panel is over. So thank you again for coming to talk with us today at TIGS about ethical game design.